The sky above Fairmount Hills Cemetery hung low with the weight of grief and time, an overcast ceiling casting long, gray shadows across rows of polished marble, weathered granite, and trembling memories that refused to fade no matter how many seasons passed, each stone a frozen moment in someone's timeline, each grave a chapter closed in someone's unfinished book. And among them walked Victoria Langston, the elusive tech billionaire whose life had been shaped by tragedy far more than triumph, though the world only ever saw the glossy magazine covers and not the tears that fell quietly on the soil where her only son, Matthew Langston, had been buried 3 years ago after a sudden brain aneurysm during his sophomore year at MIT. And as she approached his gravestone, clutching a small bouquet of white lilies in her gloved hand, her usually stoic demeanor cracked at the edges with the ache of motherhood unfulfilled, love interrupted, and the guilt that no fortune could ever ransom back the time she had traded for boardrooms and billion-dollar deals until she stopped mid-step, heart tightening as her gaze landed on the unexpected sight that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her life and her late son, a black woman in a faded blue cardigan and frayed jeans, kneeling by Matthew's grave, sobbing into her hands while a little boy, no more than 5 or 6 years old, with chestnut skin and soft curls, clutched her shoulder, confused and whispering, "Mommy, why are you crying at the nice man's name?" And Victoria stood frozen, a storm brewing inside her chest. Because this wasn't a random mourner. This wasn't just someone visiting a neighboring plot. The woman's fingers were tracing Matthew's name on the headstone with the intimacy of a lover or a widow, and Victoria, despite all her rehearsed decorum and polished poise, found herself blurting out, "Excuse me, do you know my son?" And the woman gasped, her face jerking up, streaked with tears, eyes wide in disbelief and recognition as if she'd seen a ghost or worse. The person she had been trying to avoid for years. You're Matthew's mother," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of memory and regret, and Victoria's breath caught in her throat because now that she looked closer, the boy's face mirrored Matthew's baby photo's same dimple on the left cheek, same intelligent eyes, same stubborn jawline, and the earth beneath her seemed to tilt, history rearranging itself in front of her as the woman said, "I didn't think I'd ever have to tell you. I didn't even know if I should. But that's your grandson." And with that word grandson, everything shifted like a puzzle piece sliding into place, revealing a picture that had been hidden in plain sight. And Victoria, who had survived mergers, market crashes, and paparazzi scandals, suddenly felt like the weakest person in the world as she dropped to her knees beside them, not knowing whether to cry, scream, or reach for the child who now looked at her curiously and said, "Are you the lady from the picture on Daddy's phone?" And Victoria's hand trembled as she touched the headstone, not for the first time, but for the first time knowing that Matthew had left behind not just a legacy of code and robotics, but a family, a child, a woman he had loved deeply and secretly, and she realized that all her wealth, all her grief, all her carefully constructed loneliness, had been built on the false foundation that she had buried everything with her son when in truth, something had survived, and it had a name, a heartbeat, and a future that she had never accounted for. The silence that followed was too thick for words, like the sky itself had paused to watch what would unfold next between two women who had never met but were bound by the same soul, one by blood and legacy, the other by love and sacrifice. As the little boy with chocolate eyes and a cautious curiosity fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, Victoria Langston sat back on the cold grass, knees stiff, her $1,000 wool coat soaking in the damp from the earth, but none of it registered because all she could focus on was the way the boy's mouth curled, the way his eyelashes fluttered, the familiar furrow of his brow when confused Matthew's gestures, Matthew's legacy, walking and breathing before her eyes, and the woman beside him, whose name she had not even asked, wrapped her arm protectively around the child and said with a trembling voice, "His name is Elijah," then added, as if bracing for impact, "Elijah Matthew Walker. I gave him his father's middle name." And Victoria, stunned into silence, finally found her voice brittle and cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" A question that came out too sharp, too wounded, too late, and the woman flinched, nodding as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and never found a good enough answer. "Because he didn't want you to know. Not yet. He said you'd hate me, or worse, try to take him away." And there it was, the hidden fracture. The fear that power and privilege would crush whatever fragile love Matthew had built in secret. The classic story of two different worlds held together by whispers and late-night phone calls. And suddenly Victoria remembered the Christmas when he had stayed on campus, the summer he skipped their family retreat to intern, the way he had grown quieter, more resolute, more human, and now she realized he hadn't been alone. He had chosen them, this woman, this child, over the empire she had built for him. And that stung more than betrayal. It felt like a lesson she hadn't earned. So she whispered, "He should have told me. I would have helped." But the woman shook her head. "He didn't want help. He wanted to protect what little peace we had. He said his mother lived in glass towers and hurricanes, and we lived in quiet storms." And those words hit Victoria like an avalanche of shame, because for all her billions, she had never made a home warm enough for her own son to share his deepest love. And now that home was haunted by echoes, she could never answer. So she turned to Elijah, kneeling gently in front of him, her voice softer than it had been in years. "Do you know who I am, sweetheart?" And the boy hesitated, looking to his mother first, then back at Victoria, eyes narrowing in innocent analysis before nodding. "You're the grandma from the silver frame." And that broke something inside her that had been locked up since the day they closed the casket on her boy. Because it meant Matthew hadn't erased her, he had simply edited her out for safety, for timing, for reasons she might never fully grasp. And suddenly she wasn't just mourning a son, she was meeting a future, one wrapped in messy truths and tender chances. So she asked, "Can I take you both to lunch?" And the woman whose name she finally learned was Renee hesitant, glancing at the worn sneakers on her feet and the judgment she expected in Victoria's eyes but never found. And with a cautious nod, they stood together and walked away from the grave as three strangers holding a shared memory, heading toward a Range Rover that had never seemed lonelier until now. Inside the car, Elijah stared at the buttons wide-eyed while Victoria watched the rearview mirror, not at traffic but at her past, merging with her future. And Renee, still unsure whether this was the beginning of forgiveness or a battlefield of custody, her son's hand tightly, her heart not yet ready to trust a billionaire whose world had once seemed so far above hers it might as well have been another galaxy. But even galaxies collide, and sometimes, from their chaos, a new star is born. The upscale restaurant Victoria chose was nestled at the edge of Central Park, its name whispered among socialites and power brokers, a place where reservations took months and the wine list rivaled national archives. Yet as the hostess opened the door with polished grace and called her Ms. Langston with hushed reverence, Victoria noticed how Renee instinctively stepped back, tightening her grip on Elijah's hand, her eyes darting across the chandeliers and crisp white tablecloths like they were in enemy terrain. And Victoria realized then just how loud wealth could be to someone unaccustomed to it, how the clinking of glasses, the foreign names on the menu, even the poised waitstaff felt like a test they hadn't studied for. So she leaned close to Renee and whispered, "If this feels wrong, we can leave. I just wanted somewhere quiet to talk." And Renee gave a tight nod, eyes scanning for exits, more than entrees, until Elijah broke the tension with his innocent curiosity, reaching for the butter dish and asking, "Is this yellow ice cream?" which drew a soft chuckle from Victoria and finally a smile, brief but real, from Renee. And they sat, not as billionaire and single mom, but as two women joined by a boy who began to babble about dinosaurs, space robots, and a red balloon he'd once let go in a grocery store parking lot. "Because I wanted it to fly to Daddy," a line that made Renee's voice catch and Victoria's hand curl into a fist beneath the table. Because how do you parent a child who sends messages into the sky, hoping they'll land in heaven? So she cleared her throat and said, gently, "Tell me about Matthew, about your life with him. I want to know everything." And Renee looked away, as if memory itself was too fragile to hold, then began slowly, carefully, as though unpacking a fragile heirloom. "We met at MIT, not how you'd expect. He dropped his protein shake on my laptop and spent 3 hours trying to fix it. He couldn't, but he made me laugh so hard I forgot I was angry." And as the story unfolded, Victoria heard about late-night coding sessions and ramen dinners, walks through Boston Commons with Elijah still in her belly, how Matthew had cried the day Elijah was born, how he took a photo of his tiny hand and said, "This is my new algorithm for joy." And for the first time, she saw her son not as the genius she had pushed, groomed, and funded, but as a young man who had found a way to balance dreams and diapers, who had built a life outside the spotlight, whose brilliance wasn't just in numbers but in nurturing, in choosing love over legacy. And all the while Renee kept apologizing, saying, "He wanted to tell you, but he said you wouldn't approve, that I didn't fit into your world." And Victoria's stomach twisted because she knew it was true. She had raised Matthew in a house where success was quantified, where image was everything, where anything that didn't look like a Forbes cover was quietly erased. And now she saw the price: a son who had loved in silence, a woman who had raised their child in the shadows, a grandson who had never known the warmth of her arms. So she reached across the table, ignoring the glances from nearby diners, and touched Renee's hand, not with pity, but with purpose. "I don't want to erase you," she said, voice low and shaking. "I want to know you, both of you, if you'll let me." And the silence that followed wasn't cold, but cautious, the kind that precedes storms or miracles. And then Elijah, sensing nothing but opportunity, held up a crayon from the kids' menu and said, "Can you help me draw a rocket ship, Grandma?" The word falling so naturally, so trustingly, it silenced the ache in Victoria's chest and replaced it with something rare, opened as she leaned in to draw beside him. She realized she didn't need to buy back the years she had lost. She just needed to be here now. Later, as they stepped back outside into the New York breeze, Renee finally spoke, softer than before. "He loved you, you know, even when he was mad, even when he didn't call. He carried your photo in his wallet. And that, more than any stock report or shareholder victory, was the legacy that mattered." Victoria nodded, tears pricking her eyes again, and said, I loved him too, and I already love him again in Elijah. Renee's face softened, and for the first time that day, the gap between billionaire and single mother didn't feel so widened above them. The city carried on as always, never noticing that beneath its towers of steel and glass, a new kind of family had quietly begun to form among the ruins of what was lost. In the weeks that followed that fateful meeting at the cemetery, the boundaries that once separated Victoria Langston from Renee Walker and little Elijah began to dissolve, not with grand declarations or lavish gifts, but with something far more difficult for a woman like Victoria to give: consistency, vulnerability, time. And so, every Sunday afternoon without fail, Victoria would drive herself to the modest brownstone apartment in Harlem, wearing jeans for the first time in over 2 decades, bringing with her books, Lego sets, sometimes nothing but a readiness to sit on the floor and listen as Elijah explained the universe one dinosaur at a time, while Renee stood in the kitchen, eyes cautious but softening each day as the woman she once feared as an enemy slowly revealed herself to be something more complicated, more broken, more human than legend had allowed. And in those quiet visits, over spilled juice and silly drawings, a new rhythm began to form, one that included laughter, awkward apologies, late-night emails between 2 women learning to trust, and a boy whose presence made their shared grief feel like a bridge instead of a wall. And then one day, as the autumn leaves began to scatter the sidewalks with gold and amber, Victoria stood in her Manhattan penthouse suite, staring down at the glittering city below with Elijah perched on her hip, pointing out taxis like they were wild animals, and she asked softly, "Would you two consider moving in with me, not just as guests, but as family?" And Renee, stunned and unsure, said, "Why would you want us in this world?" And Victoria, voice shaking, replied, "Because it was never supposed to be mine alone, and because I can't go another year building empires when I've only just found the one thing I'd actually die to protect." And though Renee didn't answer right away, the seed was planted, and weeks later, as Elijah raced down one of the penthouse hallways in socks and pajamas yelling, "This is the best rocket ship ever," it was clear that this towering place, once cold with marble and silence, was beginning to feel like home for the first time in years. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Renee and Victoria began untangling the messy knots of Matthew's legacy, his journals together, rediscovering old video clips, laughing through tears as they watched him dance terribly in the dorm kitchen while holding baby Elijah. And through each story and photo, Victoria mourned less and remembered more, learning not just about her son but about herself, about the ways she had failed, and the second chance she now had not just to give love, but to receive it. And it wasn't without hardship. There were nights when Renee retreated into silence, fearing she was still a guest in a life that didn't belong to her, and moments when Victoria forgot how to speak without sounding like a boardroom strategist. But through it all, Elijah remained, the bright star guiding them both, and slowly, the 2 women who had once met as strangers on sacred soil became something unexpected, not rivals, not in-laws, but something like sisters forged in loss, co-guardians of a boy who had inherited more than Matthew's eyes. He had inherited his love, his light, and now, a future with both sides of his soul standing beside him. Then one cold December afternoon, Victoria held a press conference, not in her usual tone of dominance and disruption, but with grace, announcing the creation of the Langston Walker Foundation for Innovation and Access, a multi-million-dollar initiative supporting young mothers in STEM co-founded with Renee, whom she introduced publicly for the first time as my son's partner, the mother of my grandson, and one of the finest minds I've ever known. And cameras flashed as Renee, once invisible to this world of suits and stock tickers, stood, tall, hand in hand with Victoria, while Elijah sat in the front row beside a framed photo of Matthew, whispering, "Daddy would love this." And somewhere in that moment, the old narrative cracked open. This was no longer just a billionaire grieving her son, nor a single mother trying to shield hers. This was a new family, complicated and unlikely, yet whole in ways money could never engineer, a constellation, formed not from perfect stars, but from broken pieces that found their way back to the same sky. And when the final reporter asked Victoria what she hoped Elijah would become one day, she didn't mention CEOs or scientists or Silicon Valley dreams. Instead, she looked down at the boy whose laughter now filled every corridor of her life and said, "I just hope he becomes someone who knows he's deeply loved, because everything else comes after that." And as the cameras faded and the applause echoed through the atrium, Victoria turned to Renee and whispered, "Thank you for giving me back my son, even in a way I never expected." And Renee, eyes glassy, replied, "And thank you for giving our son a world that finally sees him." And together, with Elijah between them and the memory of Matthew in every heartbeat, they walked out into the winter light, not as symbols, not as headlines, but as something far more enduring, a family, reborn from sorrow, choosing each other every single day.